At 9:17 in the morning on January 22, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George crouched inside the broken shell of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz with his cheek pressed against the wood of a rifle. Most men in his regiment had mocked for weeks, and he waited for a sign of life in the banyan groves 240 yards away, where 11 Japanese snipers had been killing his fellow soldiers faster than disease ever could, and where the branches rose so thick that even daylight fell apart before reaching the ground, and George, at 27 years of age, former Illinois state shooting champion with no confirmed combat kills, had to prove that the rifle he had bought with 2 years of National Guard pay was more than a toy meant for deer or Sunday target practice. And as he watched those vast trees sway in the still morning, ere he remembered every insult from the officers who called it a mail order, sweetheart, and every snicker from the armorer back at Camp Forest, who had asked if he planned on hunting deer or Germans, and George had said Japanese, and that answer was the only thing that had mattered to him, because he knew the Winchester Model 70 with its Lyman Alaskan scope and Griffin, and how Mount could reach farther and strike cleaner than the standard Gar. But his battalion commander had never believed him until the Japanese snipers in these groves began killing men every day for 3 straight days, and the battalion needed someone who could shoot straighter than fear itself, and that someone was George if the rifle could do what he claimed. And the truth was that rifle had barely reached him in time because the unit had shipped out before the weapon arrived at camp. And while the others cleaned their Garans during the long voyage to Guadalcanal, George could only imagine his rifle sitting forgotten in a warehouse back in Illinois until he filed the request to have it forwarded through military mail. And 6 long weeks later, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked fragile, and inside lay the rifle he dreamed of using in this very jungle, a rifle that weighed 9 pounds with another 12 ounces added by the scope, while the Garans around him weighed 9.5 pounds but lacked magnification, and the difference mattered because his Winchester was a bolt action with 5 rounds. Garans fired 8 rounds as fast as a man could pull the trigger, and Captain Morris had ordered him to leave the civilian rifle behind and carry a real weapon. Yet George brought it anyway, even into the jungles where the 132nd Infantry had relieved the exhausted Marines who had been fighting since August and who had secured Henderson Field, but had not pushed the Japanese fully out of the coastal groves or from Mount Austin, which rose 1,514 feet high, and held nearly 50 enemy bunkers, and his battalion had attacked that mountain on December 17th, and fought for 16 relentless days, losing 34 killed and 279 wounded before securing the western slope on January 2nd. And through that entire brutal struggle, George never fired a single shot from his Winchester because no sniper work had been needed there. But Point Cruz was different, with no heavy bunkers and no fixed trenches, only Japanese survivors hidden in monstrous banyan trees, where some branches were as thick as barrels and some trunks reached 8 feet around. And the snipers who lived up there knew how to wait as long as patience required. And on January 19th, one of them shot Corporal Davis while the man filled canteens, and the next day 2 more Americans died, and the day after that 3 more fell, one struck clean through the neck from a tree. The patrol had already passed twice, and by that evening the battalion commander summoned George and asked if the rifle he carried could truly do what he claimed. And George explained his experience as a marksman state champion at 1,000 yards in 1939, at age 23, the youngest winner ever 6-inch groups at 600 yards using iron sights and 5-shot clusters under 4 inches at 300 yards with the Lyman Alaskan scope. And the commander listened carefully, and then gave him the night to prepare, and said he would know by morning whether the rifle was worth keeping. And George spent the long night cleaning every inch of the Winchester, scraping away the thick cosmoline it had carried across the ocean, checking every screw, every mount, every bit of glass, then loading 5 rounds of 30-06 ammunition he had brought from Tennessee, the same cartridge used by the Garand, but tuned for accuracy, and just before dawn he walked alone to the ruined bunker overlooking the groves, carrying only the rifle, 60 rounds in stripper clips, and a canteen. And he settled into the broken concrete and aimed toward the silent trees, letting the magnification of the 2 1/2 power scope draw the world closer, and inside the fragile circle of glass he searched for the tiniest break in stillness, because movement not noise revealed a sniper, and finally at 9:17 he saw it, a faint twitch of a branch with no wind, and then a clearer shift, and then the shape of a man tucked into a fork of limbs nearly 90 feet high, facing east, watching the trail below where supplies moved. And George adjusted the scope to right for wind and steadied his breathing and pressed the trigger that broke cleaner than glass, and the shot slammed through the jungle, and the sniper fell tumbling down branch after branch until he hit the ground. And George cycled the bolt and watched for the spotter, who had to be close because Japanese snipers worked in pairs. And he knew the hunt was only beginning. The instant the first sniper hit the jungle floor, George shifted his focus back into the canopy, ready for the second man, who he knew would be nearby, because Japanese snipers always worked in pairs, and he kept the crosshairs steady while his breathing flattened into the calm rhythm he had practiced long before he ever saw combat. And at 9:43, he caught a thin slice of movement in another banyan, roughly 60 yards north of the first kill, this one only 50 feet above the ground, and sliding downward along the trunk, trying to withdraw before George could locate him. And George led the target with a slight adjustment, fired, and watched the second sniper fall backward through the branches until he struck earth with a thud. And for the first time since arriving on the island, George felt the quiet certainty that he had finally stepped into the role the battalion had desperately needed. And he ejected the spent casing, loaded another round from a stripper clip, and resumed scanning the trees just as he had done on the rifle ranges back home. But now every breath felt sharper, and every sound carried the tension of hidden danger, and the jungle around him was restless with birds and insects and distant artillery. Yet George filtered out everything that did not matter, because he knew that the third sniper would already be shifting position after hearing the previous shots. And he waited with the patience that separated a true marksman from a man simply holding a rifle. And then at 11:21, a shot hissed past and smashed into a sandbag 6 inches from his head, spraying dirt across his face and forcing him to drop down and press against the inner wall of the bunker, while he mentally traced the angle of the shot back toward the southwest. And after 3 quiet minutes, he slid back to his rifle and began a slow scan of the area from that direction. And at 11:38, he found the next sniper perched 73 feet up in a cluster of 5 banyans, 2 trees over from where he had searched earlier, and the man had shifted to a different branch, but not different tree, an error George did not forgive, and he fired and watched the figure collapse silently through the tangle of limbs until the jungle swallowed the body. And by midday, George had 5 confirmed kills in the groves, and word spread quickly through the battalion that the rifle they had mocked was now the only thing keeping men alive, and those who had laughed before now wanted to stand beside him and watch. But he refused every request because crowds drew attention and attention drew fire, and by early afternoon the remaining enemy snipers changed their tactics and stayed absolutely motionless during daylight, refusing to move even an inch, knowing that movement was the only thing that could betray them. And George spent hours studying trees without finding a single sign of life until 1600 hours, when he returned to headquarters to report, and Captain Morris met him with a very different tone than before and ordered him back into position at dawn because the battalion had finally found a weapon that worked. And the next morning, January 23rd, the sky opened with heavy tropical rain that swallowed the grove in a curtain of gray and forced George to sit quietly in the bunker while the sound of water hammered. The jungle and visibility dropped to almost nothing, but at 8:15 the rain eased, and by 8:45 the mist thinned enough for George to resume scanning. And at 9:12 he spotted the first sniper of the day, perched 290 yards out, farther than any target so far, and cleverly positioned during the storm to mask his climb. But this distance did not trouble George, because he knew his rifle and his scope and his breathing better than anything else in the world. And he held steady, squeezed, and watched the sniper drop through the branches, and the moment the body hit the ground, explosions shook the air as Japanese mortars began to fall around the bunker, attempting to triangulate his position from the sound of the shot. And the first shells landed 40 yards short, then 20, and George realized the next volley would destroy his shelter, so he grabbed the Winchester and sprinted north along the tree line, diving into a shell crater, just as the third salvo obliterated the bunker he had occupied only seconds before. And once the ground stopped trembling, he crawled out and moved to a fallen tree roughly 120 yards north, where he settled behind the trunk and resumed the hunt, and soon enough the Japanese adapted, sending out more snipers, now aware that one American marksman had been killing them with terrifying efficiency, and the dynamic shifted from simple target shooting into a deadly exchange in which hunter and hunted traded roles with every breath, and at 1423 he killed his 7th sniper, and at 1541 he dropped his 8th, a man who had climbed 94 feet into the highest branches, believing altitude alone would shield him, but as the sun shifted it carved a silhouette against the sky, revealing him to George, who waited for the perfect moment before firing, and by 1700 hours Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George in, because after 9 straight hours in hiding they needed a count, and George reported 8 kills across 2 days with 12 rounds fired 4. Mrs. and Captain Morris ordered him to continue operations at dawn the next morning, and that night George cleaned the Winchester by lantern light, wiping down the bolt and the barrel and checking the mounts once more while thinking of the 3 remaining Japanese snipers who were now the best and most experienced of the group. And those 3 he knew would be waiting for him at first light, armed with the knowledge of what he looked like, what rifle he carried, and how he hunted. By the time George lay down to rest on the night of January 23rd, he knew sleep would not come, because the weight of 8 kills in 2 days pressed on his mind, and the knowledge that only 3 enemy snipers remained sat heavy in his chest, and he understood that these last 3 would be the most skilled, the most patient, and the most determined to outthink him, and somewhere in the darkness of the Point Cruz groves, those men were also awake, considering his movements and his shots, and planning how to kill the lone American who had turned the hunt against them. And after several hours of trying to sleep, George finally sat up at 0300 and spent the final hours of night cleaning his rifle again, wiping down the scope and checking each round of ammunition before the steady drumming of rain on his tent signaled another storm sweeping across the island, and by 04:15 the sky was pouring so hard that even dawn seemed delayed, and George used the storm to his advantage, slipping quietly through the soaked jungle to a new spot 70 yards south of his previous position, a cluster of jagged rocks the Marines had once used as a machine gun nest, and the elevation of the rocks gave better angles and better concealment, and at 0743 the rain weakened into a soft drizzle, and George settled behind his rifle and began scanning the groves where the banyans rose like ancient columns beneath the grey sky, and at 0817 he discovered the 9th sniper perched unusually low, only 40 feet up in a palm tree 190 yards away. And the choice puzzled George, because true sniper doctrine favored height, yet this man had chosen concealment over elevation, letting the palm fronds hide him from anyone below. But George was not below, he was above, and the angle allowed him to see straight into the fronds, revealing a dark blur of shoulder and helmet, and he steadied his breath, and was moments away from pressing the trigger when instinct froze him, because it was too convenient and too perfect, and nothing about this war or these snipers had ever been easy, and he remembered for a moment the second kill on the first day, when he had caught a sniper fleeing down a tree trunk, because that man had known exactly how attackers would respond, and this one too would know better than to sit where an elevated shooter could see him. And George pulled back from the scope and began scanning slowly across every tree within 300 yards, working left to right, top to bottom with intense focus, and after 11 long minutes he found the real threat hidden 91 feet up in a thick banyan trunk 80 yards northwest of the palm decoy, and this sniper had perfect cover with vines and branches shielding him from every direction except one, and he had a direct line of sight to the fallen tree where George had been the previous day, waiting for George to fire at the decoy and reveal his muzzle flash. And George knew that if he fired at the real sniper first, the man would vanish before George could work the bolt, so he made a decision that required absolute precision. He pointed the scope back at the decoy hidden in the palm tree, squeezed the trigger, and watched the bait sniper jerk and fall, and within the heartbeat that followed, George swept the scope to the banyan, and there it was the faintest shift as the real sniper turned toward the sound, and George fired the instant the movement appeared, and the bullet struck the sniper before he could settle, and the body and rifle tumbled violently Through the branches and with 2 shots, George had eliminated 2 more snipers, yet he had also revealed that his location was no longer where the Japanese believed it to be. So he grabbed his rifle and scrambled east along the rocks, slipping into a drainage ditch filled with mud, just as a burst of Japanese machine gun fire shredded the rocks he had used less than 6 seconds earlier, and he pressed himself flat into the ditch, waiting through 17 seconds of fire, until silence returned, then counted 60 in his head, before moving to a new spot 100 yards east, a shell crater half filled with muddy rainwater, and George slid into the crater, letting the water rise up to his chest, gripping the Winchester with the barrel held above the surface as he resumed scanning the trees through the dripping scope, and he knew he had 10 confirmed kills and 1 sniper still alive, and that final enemy would be the sharpest of them all because he had watched 10 of his comrades fall across 3 days, and he knew George's habits and George's rifle. And he knew George would return at dawn, no matter the conditions, and George searched every tree, every branch, every cluster of vines until his eyes strained from the effort, but he found nothing, and then at 0947 movement flared at the edge of his vision, not above but below. And George suddenly understood the truth. The 11th sniper was not in the trees at all. He was crawling across the jungle floor 60 yards to the south, using thick ferns and fallen branches to shield his approach. And he was moving parallel to the tree line, heading for the rocks where he believed George had escaped after the machine gun attack. And George had almost no angle to fire because the rim of the crater blocked his view, and the sniper stopped at 0952, studying the rocks, waiting for a flicker of motion, and George remained statue still because patience was the soul of sniper work. Patience and silence and the willingness to let time trickle past until opportunity finally arrived. And after 6 minutes, the sniper resumed crawling, closing to 35 yards, then 30, then 25, and approaching from the exact direction George had fled moments earlier, and at 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks, climbed into the old machine gun nest, and stared east toward the drainage ditch, where he believed George was hiding, and now the man was 38 yards from George, but facing the wrong direction. And George nearly took the shot, but something held him because the position was too exposed, too vulnerable, and no sniper, who had survived this long, would make such an obvious mistake. And he expanded his search and found the truth at 10:06, another Japanese soldier 70 yards northwest, hidden behind a fallen log with a rifle trained on the likely escape route. And they were working together, sweeping slowly east in a coordinated search, meant to flush him out, and George slid deeper into the water until only his eyes showed, keeping the barrel pointed upward to stay dry, and waited for the right moment to strike. George stayed submerged in the muddy crater with only his eyes and the barrel of the Winchester above the surface, while the 2 Japanese soldiers continued their sweep through the grove, and he understood that the man he had just watched crawling toward the rocks was not the final sniper, but a decoy sent ahead to tempt him into revealing his position, and the real marksman was the one 70 yards northwest behind the fallen log, watching the likely escape route with perfect patience and perfect discipline. And George held still as a stone while the rain dripped from the frayed leaves above, and the thick jungle air pressed tight around him. And at 10:13, the soldier in the rocks rose from his position, looked toward the drainage ditch, and signaled toward the man behind the fallen tree, and the 2 began advancing east across the grove, working in parallel lines, and sweeping the ground, searching for the American sniper who they assumed had fled after the machine gun barrage. And George remained hidden, watching the 2 figures move steadily past the crater where he lay submerged, and as soon as their backs were fully turned, he rose silently from the water, lifting Winchester to his shoulder, letting the mud drip from his uniform, and he aimed at the nearer soldier, who had been hiding in the rocks now 42 yards away, and fired 1 clean shot, and the man collapsed instantly, and George worked the bolt, chambered another round, and swept the rifle toward the second soldier, who had already begun turning toward the sound with his weapon rising, and George shot, first dropping the man behind the fallen tree, and in those 2 shots he ended the threat of the final sniper and his partner, bringing the count to 11 dead across 3 days. But there was no time to breathe, because as he stepped from the crater retrieving the spent casings, he heard voices in the distance. Japanese voices, multiple men approaching from the tree line, and the tone carried urgency and anger, and George understood. They were coming to recover the fallen snipers or to hunt down whoever had killed them, and he slid back into the crater, submerging himself again until only his eyes remained above the water, with the rifle held upright to keep the barrel dry, while the voices grew louder, and the sound of branches snapping marked the approach of at least 6 men. And they moved first to the closest body, examining it, then shifted toward the second corpse and spoke quickly in sharp tones. And at 10:28, the voices changed direction, beginning to move toward the crater itself, because the Japanese had found his tracks, the footprints he had left in the mud during earlier fight, and he cursed himself silently for that oversight, because now he faced at least 6 enemy soldiers with only 5 rounds in the rifle, and no time to reload from his pack, which lay somewhere back near the destroyed bunker or the earlier shell crater. And at 10:31, a Japanese soldier stepped to the rim of the crater, looking directly down into the water, and their eyes met. And George fired instantly, the bullet punching the man backward and into the mud. And he worked the bolt and rose up, firing at the next 2 men who appeared at the rim, and they fell in quick succession. But now his position was blown open, and more voices shouted from the undergrowth as enemy soldiers rushed toward the crater, firing wildly, and bullets ripped into the mud and bark, and the air filled with snapping twigs and shaking leaves as George leapt from the north side of the crater and sprinted 20 yards to a fallen tree, dropping behind it, while more bursts of rifle fire tore through the space he had just left. And he lifted the scope and saw 2 soldiers advancing toward the crater 50 yards out. And he aimed at the lead man, fired and dropped him, then swung toward the second, but the man dove for cover too quickly, and George knew he had only 2 rounds left, and even worse, the shouts behind him signaled a second group of soldiers circling from the east, and another from the south, forming a tightening trap. And he understood that if he stayed, he would be cut off and killed, because a bolt-action rifle with 2 remaining shots could not fight multiple groups of infantry armed with faster weapons, and he had to break contact before they closed the distance. And so he grabbed the Winchester and ran north through the thick undergrowth, dodging vines and branches as bullets snapped the air around him and struck the trunks with sharp thuds. And he ran for 90 long seconds before diving into another crater, this one dry and deeper. And he crouched inside, listening to the distant voices, which grew fainter, confirming that the Japanese had not pursued him, but instead had returned to the bodies of their fallen comrades. And George breathed slowly, wiping mud from his rifle, checking the chamber, confirming that he still had those last 2 rounds. And when the grove fell quiet again, he climbed from the crater and began making his way northeast toward the American perimeter, moving slowly and carefully, staying low, using thick brush and terrain to shield every step. And at 10:47, he paused to listen, but heard nothing but distant artillery and the low rumble of the Pacific surf. And he continued on, and at 11:13, he reached the edge of the American line, where a Marine sentry challenged him, and after he identified himself, he was escorted to battalion headquarters, where Captain Morris waited for a report. And George delivered it straight. 11 Japanese snipers across 4 days, 12 rounds fired for those kills, only 1 miss, and 3 more enemies killed in the close fight that followed. And when Morris asked about ammunition, George answered that he had 2 rounds left. And when Morris asked about the rifle, George said it was still working but needed cleaning because mud and water had soaked into the action. And Morris told him to clean the rifle and rest because operations were over for now, and the battalion would be moving east soon, and Point Cruz would no longer be their concern. George cleaned the Winchester until the last trace of mud was gone, and the patches came out clean, yet the memory of the water-filled crater and the dead snipers haunted him even as he tried to rest. And at 1400 hours, he was summoned by division headquarters, where Colonel Ferry asked if George could train other men to do what he had done, and George answered yes, but only if he had time rifles with proper optics and soldiers who could already shoot with discipline. And Ferry said the regiment had 14 Springfield rifles fitted with unearthed scopes left behind by the Marines, that there were 40 expert marksmen in the regiment who could form the core of a new sniper section. And George agreed to lead the training on one condition, that he be allowed to keep his Winchester Model 70, and Ferry approved at once, because no officer who had heard the reports of Point Cruz doubted the value of that rifle anymore. And on January 27th, George stood on a makeshift firing range 2 miles east of Henderson Field, with 40 men lined up in the heavy heat waiting for instruction. and he explained that skill on a qualification range meant nothing without control, discipline, and the ability to stay invisible and still for hours. And he began with breathing fundamentals and trigger technique, and the ways a sniper must read wind through grass leaves and dust rather than numbers on a chart. And the Springfield rifles weighed 11 pounds with their long, unearthed scopes, and the weight made them steady yet exhausting to hold. And George taught the men to use rocks, logs, sandbags, and anything they could find to create improvised shooting rests, because the jungle never offered perfect positions. And for 3 days the men trained under increasing difficulty from 100 to 400 yards, then at targets that shifted or hid behind branches, until 32 of the 40 proved they could hit man-sized targets consistently at 300 yards in broken terrain. And George divided the group into 16 two-man teams, 1 shooter and 1 spotter, and explained that the spotter carried binoculars and a Garand and provided security and observation while the shooter engaged the targets, and after each kill the roles could switch so that no team relied solely on one man. And on February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field west of Matanikau River, where intelligence warned of scattered Japanese infantry still operating in the jungle, and George worked with a spotter named Corporal Hayes, and they set up on a ridge overlooking a trail the enemy used for movement, and at 07:20 Hayes signaled a lone Japanese soldier appearing through the foliage, and George fired once, dropping him instantly. And for the next 6 hours they engaged 7 more soldiers on that trail. 1 missed due to unexpected wind, but the rest fell, and the other teams reported similar success with 23 Japanese soldiers killed across the operation and no American losses. And as February progressed, the sniper section continued its work eliminating Japanese soldiers who acted as rearguards during the evacuation of Guadalcanal. And by February 9th, the section had 74 confirmed kills, each verified through direct observation, a number considered conservative because unconfirmed hits were not counted. And during these days the Japanese evacuation accelerated, with destroyers arriving at night to extract troops from the far western tip of the island, and American forces advanced westward under constant resistance while George and his teams picked off enemy soldiers who attempted to hold the retreat lines. And on February 7th, while operating near the Tanamboga River, George and Hayes came under sudden fire, and a Japanese rifleman struck George in the left shoulder, spinning him around and knocking him into the dirt. And Hayes dragged him behind cover, shouting for a corpsman, while bullets cracked through the air, and the medic reached them under fire and examined the wound, noting that the bullet had passed through muscle without breaking bone or striking an artery. And George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field, where doctors cleaned the wound, sutured it closed, and told him he would recover fully, but must avoid combat for at least 3 weeks. And George spent those weeks in the hospital, while the Japanese completed their withdrawal from Guadalcanal. And once the island was declared secure, the army began reorganizing its manpower for future missions across the Pacific. And during that time, news of the sniper section spread quietly through the division and through command channels, because no other unit had achieved such results with so few resources. And George lay in his cot thinking often of the 11 snipers at Point Cruz and the close fight that had nearly killed him. And he knew that although the battle for Guadalcanal was over, his war was not finished, and he wondered what the next assignment would demand of him, and whether the Winchester that had saved him so many times would be needed again, because even though the rifle sat in a wooden crate beside his bed, waiting to be cleaned and checked once more, George felt certain that the lessons he had learned in the groves would follow him long after the jungle wounds healed and long after the sound of gunfire faded in the distance, because the war was shifting and new operations were forming, and the men who had proven themselves in one place were being quietly marked for roles in the next. When George finally left the field hospital, the wound in his shoulder still ached, but his mind was already focused on returning to his men and on the future of the sniper section he had created. And when he reached the battalion camp, Captain Morris told him the battalion would soon move east, because the Japanese evacuation from Guadalcanal was nearly complete and Point Cruz no longer held strategic value. And George returned to his tent and sat with the Winchester on his lap, feeling the familiar weight as he field stripped every component, cleaned away the grime and tropical moisture. They polished the barrel until the patches came out clear, and after reassembling the rifle, he checked the scope mounts and loaded 5 fresh rounds, knowing he would need the weapon in perfect condition for whatever assignment came next. And at 1400 hours, a messenger arrived and told George that the regimental commander wanted to see him, and George walked to headquarters expecting criticism for breaking contact during the fight near the crater, or for firing rounds without direct orders. Yet when he arrived, he found Captain Morris Colonel Ferry and another officer waiting for him, and Ferry asked a single question: could George train others to use rifles the way he had used his Winchester at Point? Cruz and George answered that he could, but only if he had time rifles with optics and men who already possessed the basics of marksmanship, and Ferry said that was exactly what he could provide, because the Marines had left behind 14 Springfield rifles fitted with unearthed scopes, and the regiment had 40 soldiers who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment, and Ferry wanted George to form a true sniper section, train them, and deploy them against any remaining Japanese forces, and George agreed, but with one request: he wanted to keep his Winchester Model 70, and Ferry approved that instantly because the rifle had proven itself beyond all doubt. And on January 27th, George assembled the 40 men at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field, and he saw immediately that these soldiers might be accurate on paper, but they lacked the instincts required of snipers, and George began from the ground up teaching breathing, discipline, trigger, squeeze, natural points of aim, and the importance of blending into terrain. And the Springfield rifles weighed 11 pounds with their long, heavy, unearthed scopes, a weight that created stability, but also exhaustion, and George taught them to brace rifles against rocks, logs, or tree trunks, because the jungle rarely rewarded a shooter who tried to fire unsupported, and range training lasted 3 days, and each day the students fired from greater distances, from 100 yards to 400 yards, then at silhouettes half hidden behind branches, and then at targets that moved unpredictably through the foliage. And by January 30, 32 of the 40 men consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards even in field conditions, and George then divided them into 16 two-man teams, 1 shooter and 1 spotter, and explained that the spotter served as both eyes and guardian, carrying binoculars, and a garand and identifying targets, while protecting the shooter. And after each confirmed kill, the roles would switch to keep both men capable and prevent dependence on a single marksman. And on February 1st, George took 4 of the new teams into the field west of the Matanikau River, where intelligence had reported small enemy units still operating, and George partnered with Corporal Hayes, and they climbed onto elevated ground, looking down upon a narrow trail where Japanese soldiers often moved supplies. And at 07:20 Hayes spotted a figure, and George fired a single round that dropped the man instantly, and over the next 6 hours, the team engaged 7 more Japanese soldiers down that same trail, scoring 6 confirmed kills with 1 miss due to wind shift. And the 3 other teams reported similar results, totaling 23 confirmed kills with no American casualties. And the sniper section continued to operate through early February, striking at Japanese rear guard units who attempted to delay the American advance while the main Japanese force evacuated from the western coast. And by February 9, the section had 74 confirmed kills, a number that did not include unverified targets. And as the evacuation accelerated, American commanders pushed west to intercept retreating Japanese formations, and George and his teams provided crucial overwatch, removing key enemy riflemen hidden in the foliage who attempted to slow American movements. And on February 7, while operating near the Tanamboga River, George was struck in left shoulder by a Japanese rifleman, and the impact spun him around and dropped him into the dirt, and Hayes dragged him behind a rise and called for a corpsman, who reached them quickly and treated the wound, which had passed cleanly through muscle without striking bone or artery. And George was evacuated once more to a field hospital where doctors cleaned, closed and dressed the wound, and told him he would survive but must refrain from combat for at least 3 weeks. And during his recovery, the Japanese completed their evacuation from Guadalcanal, and by the time George was released, the island campaign was considered finished, and the United States Army turned its attention toward new operations across the Pacific. And during these quiet days, George thought often of the 11 snipers he had killed, and of the close battles in the flooded crater, and the weight of the work he had done. and he wondered what assignment might come next, and whether the skills he had honed in the groves of Point Cruz would be needed in some harsher, more distant jungle. Because although he had survived the island, he knew the war was far from over, and his role within it was only beginning to form. By the time American forces reached Cape Esperance on February 9, they found it abandoned and silent, and the long, brutal campaign for Guadalcanal had officially come to an end, and the sniper section George had created operated for 12 days with 74 confirmed kills, and not a single casualty among his trained marksmen, and their efficiency was noted by division. Command and Colonel Ferry submitted George's name for a Bronze Star, while the battalion prepared for future operations. Yet George's war did not pause, because as he recovered from his shoulder wound in the field hospital, new orders arrived from Pacific Command stating that experienced combat officers were needed for an assignment deep in Burma. And although the mission details were classified, the hints suggested long-range patrols through heavy jungle and operations behind Japanese lines, tasks that demanded endurance, silence, and deadly accuracy, and George volunteered without hesitation. And by March he stood aboard a transport ship heading west across the Pacific with his Winchester Model 70 sealed in a waterproof case in the hold, and the Lyman Alaskan scope wrapped in oilcloth, and he did not know what lay ahead, only that it would require skills he had learned in the groves of Point Cruz. And the march of war led the convoy across thousands of miles until the transport finally reached India on April 3, and there George and 200 other officers received their briefing. They were to join a new unit, 3,000 men drawn from across the army with no permanent designation yet, and the men had already begun calling themselves Merrill's Marauders after Brigadier General Frank Merrill, who led them, and the unit would officially become the 537th Composite Unit on May 28, 1943. Though the training had begun long before that, and the work these men prepared for was unlike standard infantry operations, because the Marauders were modeled on the British Chindits specialized jungle fighters, who could survive deep behind enemy lines without supply roads, without artillery, and without the constant support of larger formations. And George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion, not formally as a sniper, because the United States Army at that time had no official sniper designation in its organizational structure, but rather as a rifle platoon leader, though his commanders quietly understood that his marksmanship surpassed anything normally seen in infantry ranks, and training began in the scorching heat of central India, with endless drills in long-range penetration, tactics, survival, navigation, river crossing, and silent movement, because Burmese jungle was considered far more hostile than Guadalcanal, with steeper hills, denser foliage, heavier rain, and a Japanese force that knew the terrain better than any American unit possibly could. And George studied his equipment, carefully adapting it for the long marches ahead, because the Winchester that had served so well on Guadalcanal would become a burden on multi-week patrols through unforgiving terrain. And so he removed the heavier Lyman Alaskan scope and replaced it with a lighter Weaver 330, which offered the same 2 1/2 power magnification at 8 ounces less weight, and he even replaced the wooden stock with a lightweight synthetic version, bringing the rifle weight from 9 pounds 12 ounces down to 8 pounds 14 ounces, a difference small in numbers, yet enormous when traveling hundreds of miles through jungle while carrying 60 pounds of gear. And by February 1944, the Marauders entered Burma, their mission clear. They were to advance North Break through enemy territory and capture the airfield at Myitkyina, an objective critical to Allied supply lines into China, and Japanese forces guarded the region with roughly 4,000 well-supplied soldiers, and the route required the Marauders to climb steep mountains, wade through rain-swollen rivers, and push through choking jungle with no roads or rest points. And all supplies had to be carried on the backs of men or pack mules, because no motor vehicles could navigate the environment. And the march began on February 24, and the first week alone saw the battalion cover 83 miles of jagged wilderness, leaving exhaustion stamped into every face, and malaria swept through the ranks, striking down men each day, and mules broke legs on rocky slopes and were shot to spare their suffering. And yet the Marauders pressed forward, fighting 12 skirmishes by March against Japanese patrols and ambush forces, because their mission was not to hold ground, but to move like a blade slipping behind enemy lines, disrupting supply chains and spreading confusion. And George used his Winchester only 3 times during the march, because most firefights erupted at ranges too close to demand a scope. and each time he fired was a moment of necessity, once at 412 yards to kill a Japanese officer directing troops across a river, once at 380 yards against a machine gun nest that threatened to pin down his platoon, and once at 290 yards against a sniper who had trapped a Marauder patrol. And in each engagement, George fired only a single shot because the crack of the Winchester carried far and a second shot would reveal his position, and the weeks bled into months as the men slogged through swamp heat and disease and exhaustion. And by late May, the Marauders had marched more than 700 miles through terrain many officers once considered impassable, and they had lost more men to sickness than to enemy fire as malaria, dysentery, and typhus ravaged the unit, and the 5,300 men who began the operation dwindled to fewer than 3,000 effective fighters, yet still, they reached their objective, and on May 17 they seized the airfield at Myitkyina in a costly victory that rendered the Marauders' combat ineffective because their bodies could endure no further hardship, and George survived the Burma campaign. And the Winchester survived with him, though it was used far less frequently because most combat took place at 50 yards or less inside walls of vines where visibility shrank to 30 feet, and through these conditions, George understood something important about the future of warfare, that while the Winchester Model 70 was one of the finest bolt-action rifles ever built, modern battlefields were shifting toward faster weapons and tactics that demanded different tools, yet even so he kept that rifle close because it had carried him through 2 campaigns, and its legacy had already been etched into the hidden corners of war. When the Marauders finally completed their mission in Burma, George knew his time on the front lines was ending because the unit had been pushed far beyond its limits, and disease, hunger, and exhaustion had hollowed out its strength. And by June 1944, the surviving Marauders were evacuated and the shattered unit was disbanded, and George returned to the United States carrying with him the Winchester Model 70 that had followed him across half the world, and the Army promoted him to captain and assigned him to Fort Benning in Georgia, where he became an instructor teaching marksmanship and small unit tactics to incoming officers, and those lessons were carved from his memories in the jungles of Guadalcanal and the mountains of Burma, where every movement, every breath, and every decision could mean survival or death. And George kept the Winchester in a footlocker in his quarters, a rifle that had begun as a mocked mail order purchase and had become one of the most effective tools any American soldier carried during the early Pacific War. And although he taught others how to fight, he rarely looked at the rifle because the world was changing, and the Army now focused on standardization, mass production, and tactics suited for vast formations armed with identical weapons, and George accepted the shift because modern warfare demanded it, and the Pacific Islands continued to fall one by one, while in Europe, American forces pushed toward Germany, and somewhere between these massive fronts the importance of individual marksmen with privately owned rifles faded into the background, but the Winchester remained with him, a relic of a time when one man with one rifle could change the fate of an entire battalion, and when George was honorably discharged in January 1947 as a lieutenant colonel decorated with 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and a Combat Infantry Badge. He returned to Illinois and used the GI Bill to study politics at Princeton University, where he graduated with highest honors in 1950, and afterward he traveled to Oxford for 4 years studying political systems and cultures, and then ventured to British East Africa, where he spent another 4 years examining regional institutions, and later George settled in Washington, D.C., where he served as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations before joining the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute as a consultant and lecturer on African politics. And through all these years, he never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma, or the 11 snipers he killed in the Point Cruz groves, nor did he mention the countless moments of terror and clarity forged inside jungles where visibility was measured in feet and life expectancy in seconds. And his colleagues knew he had served in the Pacific, but they never knew the extent of what he had done, and the Winchester remained tucked away in its case, a silent witness to a chapter of war he shared with no one. And in 1947, George decided he should record the details of his experiences not for fame or publication, but to preserve the technical knowledge of jungle warfare and the reality of what had happened before memory could erode the facts. And he wrote for 6 months filling page after page until the manuscript grew to more than 400 pages, and when a friend of the National Rifle Association read parts of it, he insisted that George publish the work, saying that no other account captured the technical realities of small arms combat with such clarity. And although George hesitated because the book focused heavily on weapons ballistics and the practical lessons of survival rather than dramatic heroics, he agreed, and the manuscript was published under the title Shots Fired in Anger, becoming an unexpected classic among firearms enthusiasts and military historians who valued its precise observations, its unembellished honesty, and its rare first-hand descriptions of Japanese weapons and field conditions during the war. And the book remained in print for decades, serving as a reference for collectors, scholars, and soldiers who sought to understand how small arms shaped battles in the Pacific. And George lived long enough to watch the United States enter 3 more wars in Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf, and he watched military rifles evolve from the Gare and to the M14 to the M16, and he watched sniping grow from a scattered improvisational skill into a formal military specialty with dedicated schools, doctrines, and purpose-built rifles, and he saw new generations of soldiers studying lessons that men like him had learned through necessity inside wet foxholes and sweltering jungles. And on January 3, 2009, George died at 90 years of age, leaving behind a life defined not by glory, but by competence, discipline, and extraordinary marksmanship. And the Winchester Model 70, that had changed his path, was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia, where it was placed behind glass with a small placard describing its history, and most visitors walked past it without a second glance, not realizing that it was far more than an old hunting rifle, because it was the weapon that proved one determined marksman with a mail order scope could outshoot professional Japanese snipers, and it was the rifle that cleansed the Point Cruz groves in 4 days when an entire battalion could not do it in 2 weeks. And it was the rifle that reshaped American thinking on individual marksmanship during modern war. And though thousands of museum visitors never paused to notice it, the rifle remained a quiet monument to the idea that sometimes one man with one weapon and one clear mission can change the outcome of history. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.